Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
And Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice.
Today's episode is our 4-year birthday celebration episode with the theme of appreciating how far we have come and a reminder that it is okay to be proud. Our intention today is to share another uncomfortable but worthwhile and powerful practice celebrating growth and success.
We'll share with you what we have learned from our podcasting journey, and hopefully you can get lots and lots of takeaways from those.
So I will start with what I have learned over the last 4 years of podcasting. And it's really 4.5, because I would say it took us about 6 months to launch the first episode, decide to do it, and understand what it took to start a podcast and how to do it, and make a whole bunch of mistakes. So I will actually say I've learned that it's fine to start with a whole bunch of mistakes and something can still turn out really well. The other thing more recently that I have come to learn and really notice is that lots of people are listening. And when we record, I don't think about people listening. I'm just thinking about the conversation and the topic. But I have been receiving more and more emails of people saying that they've listened, or I got one yesterday about someone who was binge listening to our podcast. And it's just fun to think that when you put something out in the world, someone out there is listening and someone out there is getting something and learning from it. And so this will actually be my encouragement to, we love to hear that you're listening, and we love to hear what you got from it. And it's inspiring to us as we do the work to record and put it out there, that to remember that people are listening. And my next learning is that most people are kind about what you put out there. Most people aren't critical. I think we were trained very much to worry what people would think and what they would say. And my learning has been that most people appreciate what we have to say, and most people are kind. And even when they don't, and even when they have a feedback, they're usually trying to be kind. And it's usually something that we don't know on our end. And so it has been helpful when listeners have pointed out an issue with volumes or audio or things like that. The next learning, a big one for me, and it's come in many realms, but podcasting has really, really helped with it, is to trust yourself. I think we trust ourselves on topics and trust that it's going to turn out fine and that it will get figured out, and that we don't have to overplan episodes or know exactly what we're going to talk about. And so it's allowed me to trust myself and really trust the world in receiving me as me in a much more easeful way. And then the last learning that is really something I bring up often with clients is to know yourself and know your brain and know your weaknesses. And so if I were to, after recording an episode, listen to it before we published it, I would probably never publish it because I would find something in it I didn't like. And so we record I send it to our VA and she edits it. And I don't listen to it until after it's been published, because then it's much harder. And then if there's some gross problem with it, I will go back and we can fix it. But she's listening to it as she's editing it. And she has come to me if there's an issue. But generally, not listening to it allows me to be much more brave and put more things out in the world that I wouldn't if I sat and got into the nitty gritty of it.
So I have learned that I enjoy sharing thoughts and my trials and tribulations of life in this way, still 4.5 years later. I've also learned in this actually reflecting exercise that I appreciate and am still grateful. And most importantly, I'm still enjoying working with you on this, Jessie, amongst other things, but this in particular, because this has been like the longest longitudinal project that we've shared. And I've also noticed over the years, we can say that over the years of podcasting, that we've really covered a lot, so many different topics. And yet there are still so many different topics to explore that we haven't touched upon. And yet there's also resharing and rediscussions as time goes on. We have different slants and perspectives and insights that have come a long way with similar topics, but different content in these podcasts. I've also learned that it's okay to take a few weeks off from recording. That remember that one week where we actually didn't release a podcast because life totally happened, and we gave ourselves great permission to basically say, well, we're just not gonna put out an episode this week. So giving ourselves permission to not feel the pressure of having to feel rushed to produce something that is suboptimal or not with presence and intention like we set up each of our podcasts with, and then having to like rush and upload that. And then lastly, I'll share that infrequently, because oftentimes if I'm sick, I will actually just cancel podcasts recording sessions. But when I'm like on the tail end of a cold, I still have a little bit of sniffles, I still, after listening to my mindful moment offerings, feel like, yeah, I still have a pretty darn powerful voice, even if it's not 100%.
Next, we wanted to reflect on who we are now compared to when we began this podcasting journey 4 years ago. And I'm quite a different person in so many ways, but specifically thinking about who I am as a podcaster and maybe even I'm going to call myself a YouTube yoga star podcaster, but that version of putting yourself out in the world and who am I in terms of that, and maybe as a public speaker too, because we've done a few episodes on that, and they all tie together. And in that realm of allowing myself to be seen, I am definitely much more comfortable, and I'm much more creative and willing to try and fail. And so the more global word I would use for that is more confident. For the most part, never 100%. I rarely compare and despair anymore. I think you see a lot of noise and energy about podcasts and how many this and how many that. And it doesn't matter. We're on our own journey. We're doing it our own way. And one thing I've really come to appreciate is it's not the number of downloads, though that is kind of a fun measure because there's really not any other way to measure it. To me, it's hearing the impact that the podcast has made. And so I don't need, if it impacts one person each podcast, that's reason enough to do it. I, for the most part, feel like we belong as podcasters. I don't feel like we're doing something where we're not supposed to be out on the airwaves. And it has been a great practice in feeling like I belong, which is, as we've mentioned, something I'm working on this year, but that podcasting has actually a place where I do feel like we belong. We have a reputable podcast that shows up and people know of it and hear of it. And when people find it, they binge watch or binge listen. I can't say binge listen, but that's really cool that people binge listen. I think I have also become more flexible and easygoing. I was always that to a degree, but when it was something that was going to be out there in the world where that might be judged and I didn't have control over it, or when I was going to be a public speaker, I would worry. I have gotten better at less is more. I think I'm still working on that. I would love to, and here's something I could work on. So I'm not allowed to say that today. We'll talk about that later. But I've gotten better at less is more. And the last piece that I think has really changed in me is that when I first started, I had this idea that the podcast was somehow separate from what I do. And now I don't worry at all about oversharing or giving away secrets. And I think many people say, oh, I'll just listen to the podcast. But I know that when people who listen to the podcast, they then come and work with me. And people who work with me, when they listen to the podcast, they get so much more out of it. And so they're really, I can't give away too much. It's not that it's a secret, because it's a very different experience of the same work when you're doing the work on you in a private group or at a retreat or one-on-one. And so I don't really have to think about that at all anymore, which feels very freeing. And I love that.
We have a little bit of overlap, but actually, interestingly, not that much overlap. So overall, I am less anxious about recording. At the beginning, and I think, Jessie, you can definitely attest to this, I was like pretty anxious about recording. I was afraid of making mistakes, and I had a very scripted type of approach to our podcast. But then as the years, I love saying that, years wore on, even now I'm like going off script. I'm just saying that I feel much more comfortable in being spontaneous when we record. Sure, I still get nervous when I public speak, and I probably will always be a little bit nervous before I do some public speaking, but at least with podcasting, I feel a lot more relaxed when recording. Yeah, and so in terms of like the outline, so here's a little behind the scenes look, dear listeners. For each episode, we actually do have a plan. There is an outline. We are not just freewheeling and completely spontaneous, though a lot of the interjections and a lot of the questions and curiosities and interruptions, the lovely interruptions that arise, are not scripted. So we used to be much more close to the outlines that we had put together, but now we have engaged in not just the personal development of flexibility, but like as the podcast has evolved, there's been in this spaciousness in creation with the flexibility, where there's more organic flow, more of that spontaneity as we record together. And even if it means, because we are always real in our podcast, that like, yeah, we sometimes will talk over each other and like ask each other questions like at the same time, or interrupt at the same time. And Mary, our editor, has to edit out the big ones. But we also, a little backdoor secret nugget here is that like we actually purposely keep in a lot of the quote unquote imperfections, because it keeps it authentic. Like in normal human conversations, there is going to be some time where there are interruptions and people talking over each other. And so we like to stick to that authenticity of what we put out there, because that's who we are. Like we are imperfectly perfect. The other aspect about who I am now, after the last 4.5 years of doing this, is that I'm frankly less afraid to speak my truth. And I know that not all of the listeners will necessarily agree with how I approach something or what I thought about it, but I'm definitely less afraid to have that be a reality. And I'm also less afraid of being vulnerable, because it's actually really therapeutic for me when I do feel comfortable sharing something that's vulnerable. And as you said, Jessie, like even if it helps one person, that potential to even help one person really makes this more difficult, vulnerable sharing like all the more worthwhile. It like gets me to my learning and growth edge, which is a good thing for me from a personal development standpoint as well as a podcast development and evolution standpoint. And then I will touch upon the compare and despair, because I had the false belief that the number of downloads somehow equated to our podcast's value or worth. But like, how ridiculous is that? Like, that is not an established currency. So now I don't compare our numbers to other people's podcasts. I like to see our trends here and there, but like, I've really detached that worth value from numbers, because really I'm doing this for the sake of my own enjoyment and the desire to help others in this way and to continue working with you, Jessie, in this way as well.
It's fun.
Yeah.
I will say, because it's fun, while you were just reflecting on that, I did go look and see how many downloads we had. And we are 50 downloads short of 140,000, which is pretty cool. So I honestly, and I've mentioned this before, I have no idea what that means. I asked Mary, who edits our episodes, and she does edit them quite minimally and by our request. But she said, well, that's only the people who download them. So actually more people listen. But isn't that cool anyway? I don't know what the number means, but it's a lot. And it means that at least 140,000 people have downloaded some version of the Mindful Healers podcast, and that's pretty cool. And I'm going to use this as a moment to ask you to share it with other people, because that tells me it does bring value, whatever the number means. It brings some value to some people, and the people who probably most need it don't know it's out there. And so if you have found it, because we are not big splashy people who put out advertisements and try to share in unmindful ways, I think that our podcast probably is growing slower than it would if we were to do some of those things, but that's not really our style. And so we need all of you to help us. Next, we wanted to jump into what we have done well and what has gone well. And more specifically, what we have done well. And those of you who have joined me for my Ending Well, Beginning Well yoga series, we had a whole class on focusing on what you did well. And we often talk about what went well, things that are out of our control that went well, luck, for example. But what we did well brings us back to this ownership and being proud, which many of us have a lot of difficulty doing. But it's a tremendously valuable practice, and also uncomfortable, as we mentioned at the outset. So what I love about this is that I made an initial list, and Ni Chang came behind me and she was like, yeah, all those. So we'll run through the things that we think we did well. And I love that we both thought that many of the same things, if that makes sense. So number one thing we've done well is we have kept it fun for ourselves and hopefully for our listeners. But I think many people have said to me, how do you keep going for 4 years? And how do you keep having episodes? And how do you keep making it work? And I will say, because it's fun, because it's not a job, it's not a task. And when we think about guests to bring on or topics that we want to do, like we might have thought about a topic we want to share and we're like, yeah, that doesn't sound fun. We don't do it. We just do something that sounds fun, that feels in the moment exciting and inspiring. The second thing that we have done super well, and I'm taking this one because you've mentioned it a few times, is doing it together. And that I think originally we had kind of this conversation, should we do our own podcast? Should we do it together? And we both liked the idea of doing something together and having that support. And we were both guests on a different podcast recently, and they asked us about like, why did we do it together? And why do we keep doing it together? And I think the benefits, that's what made me think of this. The benefits of doing it together is amazing. We can spell each other when we're tired. We can interview different guests at different times. We have so much flexibility, like doing a podcast together, doing some solo casts. Like there's so many different ways of doing it. And to have someone who you can collaborate with and who can inspire you and who can pick you up when you're dragging in terms of your energy is really a powerful tool. It's also, I think, led us to a whole new level of friendship, because it means that we see each other for a retreat once a year, and we probably see each other in San Diego because I head down there a fair bit, but not very regularly. And yet we see each other on Zoom to record podcasts several times a month. And so that makes it just an amazing, really deep relationship. And while we talk on the podcast about things, we often talk about things before and after. And so for us, it's been this opportunity to build a friendship with an adult that I don't have that relationship with anybody else. So I think that's cool.
Well, I want to echo that. I'm very grateful for the debriefings before and even sometimes after, and sometimes we've actually just like replaced podcast recording altogether with just like catching up on each other's lives, or like holding space for something that's more challenging for each other. So just gratitude all around.
Love that. And one other thing I have reflected on to others when I'm talking about the podcast is that you and I are super different. And while we both bring this mindful leaning and perspective to it, I think when we talk about things, our approaches are very different. And so by having two different perspectives, it can be a more balanced perspective and different, like just it keeps it interesting. And I learn things from you and you learn things from me. So were I just here talking about what I do, it would be a very different experience for listeners. And so I think that for me, it's really added to the impact and learning for us and for everyone else listening. Another thing we have done super well is to be authentic and to not follow what the recipe for a good podcast. When we first started, we signed up with a number of people to help us, and there are lots of recipes about how to start a podcast and how to do it well and all the things you're supposed to need. And that did not work for us at all. And a lot of the things didn't work, even that they recommended, but it just wasn't us. And so we went through two different sets of people helping us, podcast companies that everybody else loved, and this was how you're supposed to do it, and it wasn't for us. And so we do not batch record. We don't always have guests. We don't, we mix it up. We do 1, 2, 3 people. We do episodes where we talk about different topics. We don't really have a niche, I don't think. And I think that authenticity is kind of fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah, and our most recent experimental split episode on intentions, that was really fun to just put that out there, not knowing really what you had said already, but trusting, right? Like really trusting that it would just fit together.
Yeah, so cool. And I do want to take a minute to call out our amazing VA, Mary, who is also very flexible and very authentic. And she is not a podcasting company, but she is just the most amazing person who listens and lets it be authentic. And when we worked with other people, they sped up the mindful moment, for example, because we were wasting time and airtime and space, which is not supposed to be. And so I think having a third person amidst who understands who we are and what we do. And she also tells us like if there's our audio volumes are mismatched and gives us different tips. And she's an amazing human. So we couldn't do it without her on the back end. And hopefully when she edits this episode, she'll hear that.
Yes. Thank you, Mary. And thank you for letting me turn in my mindful moments like really last minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, so going along the same lines, I want to summarize it and say that like we've really simplified our production process, right? Like we've really taken ownership of the creative process, and what ends up getting put out in the world is very close to what actually gets recorded in real time with Jessie and me. We literally pick a date and time. We decide on topics sometimes really well in advance, like Jessie has this amazing folder with like a bajillion different other folders in there for future podcast episodes that I can't wait for all of you to hear. But other times it's very spur of the moment. It'll be like, okay, well, we were going to plan on recording these 2 topics, but now like this came up in my life and like we really need to record on it. So like those two other episodes get shoved out of the way, and then we talk about like the real time situation because it's fresh. And like some of the other episodes, like Jessie has coached me through some pretty tumultuous times and recorded it on podcasts. And that can't happen without that flexibility and spontaneity that we have allowed to be what this podcast is. And then, of course, like I think as the years have progressed, we've really given ourselves grace, Jessie, for this podcast to be canceled when there's personal life debriefs that need to happen in place of recording, and also because of illness and life in general. Like we have been, I think, quote unquote, much more easy on ourselves with regards to giving ourselves permission to just cancel and not put out something that particular week. And I love to say this as part of the simplification process, but really the only outside constraint to this podcast is really Mary's vacation schedule. So another shout out to Mary. So we have to ensure that we have some in the queue for her to upload until she gets back. And honestly, in reflecting about all of the simplifying that we did over the years, it's really liberating and freeing. Like it's a really good feeling. And I think that's why it has continued to be fun and collaborative and a growth area for the both of us.
Yeah, I agree. I think this lightheartedness and also the ability to find, so if you're sick, I will do one on my own, or I'll find a guest, and just this sort of flexibility that we can just make whatever happen. And we trust that the other person has good intent and is going to figure it out and it's all going to work out in the end it's really been a great place to experiment with that strategy and get feedback over time that I think almost every episode has worked to some degree and has helped someone to some degree. We also have really benefited from feedback and solicited feedback, asked for help and feedback from our listeners. And I've had unsolicited feedback sometimes that, oh, I love your podcast, but I noticed this. And I really appreciate that because we've been working on matching my volume and Ni-Cheng's volume for years because I don't know why. And someone brought it up to me recently again, and then we found, I think, the solution. And so we appreciate that. Like we're just humans trying to figure this out. And as it turns out, there isn't a best practice. And my husband, who's my tech guy, and he's pretty tech savvy, still hadn't been able to figure this out. And Mary hadn't been. So we do really appreciate like people's feedback and thoughts. And when I was working with the speech coach last year, I asked her to listen, and she had amazing thoughts and suggestions. And years ago, Hillary, who also came on, gave us some very early on amazing suggestions. And so we love your feedback and suggestions and ideas. And we won't take them exactly, but we'll meld them into who we are. And so if you have thoughts, send them our way because it makes the process more fun.
So we've also invested in good audio setups. So I used to have a pretty cheapo podcast microphone, but have invested in like a really good quality microphone, which incidentally isn't really working right now, but nevertheless. And then I know Jessie has tried different microphone setups too, and so we've really wanted to create a sound experience for all of you that is as optimal as we can get it while we're recording this in real time.
Yeah, and I think, others may not realize, but the room in which you record changes your audio too. And so figuring out like where we need to record and what the setup needs to look like has been a big and interesting learning because I'm not an audio person. That being said, I also want to give a shout out to my husband, who is an audio person and cares a lot about audio. And so he is, I was telling someone the other day, he's my research person. He does all the research and then comes back to me with, these are the choices. Which one do you like? And I think that has been really helpful along the way. So another shout out for getting help helps. and let other people who are good at certain things do what they're good at if that's not your thing.
One thing that makes our podcast unique, and that we've done well, is the embedding of formal mindfulness practices. So we have consistently offered brief formal mindfulness practices in each episode. And I just shared with you, like sometimes it's a pretty last minute recording that we send to Mary. And then you, Jessie, just shared that we are just shy of 140,000 downloads. So if you think about it, that's almost 140,000 opportunities to practice mindfulness shared with the world, and probably even more because those are just the downloads. So I think that's kudos and pats on the back to us for committing to ensuring and prioritizing that we are embedding some formal mindfulness practice into each episode. And along with that, similar line of thought is that because our podcast is not following some sort of recipe, so these reflection questions in almost every episode that we offer, along with the mindful moments, that was like our own idea in creation. There wasn't someone that said, oh, you need to do this. We just thought it was a good idea. And those parts of the podcast have persisted and really, I think, make us stand out. And in fact, if you go back and listen to the reflection questions themselves, that exercise in listening to reflection questions and thinking about the responses in and of themselves can be its own practice. And in fact, they can become journaling prompts. And it's inspiring me to actually ask Mary to potentially like take out all the reflection questions and like we can put together like some sort of document or like a journal.
They could be, once we get to episode 365, which is not that far away, like an entire journal, like each, because they're on a theme, each of them. So it's not like each question, but each batch of questions could be a set. We could also do 52, the 52 best, and have a weekly reflection question. We could have a book right there.
There you go.
The podcast book.
Look at that. We are
cool.
creating a book in real time with you, dear listener, as the first people to hear about that upcoming book. So here's the thing, is that like, it's not to say that we are perfect and we've put out this perfect product. Not at all. And we're actually just going to leave it at that. We have shared with you what we have thought that has gone well, how we have changed over the last 4.5 years, how this podcast has changed over the last 4.5 years. And we're going to leave it at that. It is somewhat uncomfortable, and I'm naming this, to leave it as that because we're not, quote unquote, balancing it with the negative. So we are actually very purposefully practicing positive attention bias, acknowledging that the negative attention bias is still present. And it's still like, still there, but we don't have to address that on this podcast right now.
And that is something I want to reflect on for a moment, because it's something I've also done at the end of my retreats. When I first started doing retreats, I would ask for people's feedback at the end, like, oh, what went well? What would you change? And I would get to the end and I would be like, oh, people feel like they have to tell you something you would change and feel like you have to figure out what you need to work on. And then I would feel discouraged. So I changed to only asking people what they loved and leaning into, well, I don't want to obviously don't want to get rid of something that people love. And it's actually been this incredibly powerful experience because I feel really good. And it's become a strengths-based, growing on what I'm doing well. And that has actually, I think, been one of the secrets to the success of the retreats, is that they just get better and better and better. And things that nobody ever mentions they love, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I don't need to do that again. And by the way, the world always tells you things they don't love. People don't shy away from saying, hey, this thing didn't work, or you need to fix this. There's so much of that we don't need any more of that. And so I loved this lens of focusing on the positive. And I will say, when I first started doing that retreats, I also was like, you can't do that. We weren't trained to do that. And in fact, when I was the chief of pediatrics, when we gave year-end feedback, we had to have things they could improve on. And you had to put something in the box. It had like the red star. And if you didn't put it in the box, you couldn't close it. And this just makes people feel terrible. And they focus on that one thing that you had to like sit there and try to figure out what they should improve on instead of all the things. It's like the feedback sandwich or whatever. So we're not doing that here. We're focusing on what's going well, what we're learning, and using that as a launching pad to who knows what's next. But we know also sort of neurochemically that when you focus on the positive things, you're releasing all those neurochemicals that help you be creative and be curious and do more amazing things. So being strategic here and also feeling a little uncomfortable because it's not really what we were taught. So we encourage you all to do that as well. Think about what you've done well, what you learned, how you grew, where you succeeded, and potentially shift more into that. Life can be a lot better, and it's not a pass or complacent. It's actually a powerful tool. So we wanted to end with our birthday wish list from you because we spend a lot of time and energy putting this out into the world, and our guests do too. And we would like to ask for some birthday gifts because why not? So go first.
All right. So please share the podcast with at least 5 people, like in your Facebook groups or other social media platforms with your trainees, like your med students, your residents, fellows, and other colleagues, as well as friends and family. And I'm also going to put out there, like, don't be afraid to share this podcast with your patients too. Just remembering that, like, every episode has a mindful moment, and not every episode is going to be applicable to your patients, but like, some of my patients have definitely been listening and they have been commenting, and they really also benefit from this as well.
And a nudge that those mindful moments are our gift to you. And so practice the mindful moment. I meant to mention that earlier. Don't just turn it off when we get to the end of the main part. The mindful moment is there for you. It's a gift. And you can only do that. If you're looking, a lot of people say, where do I find a good mindfulness practice? Go to the last 5 minutes of the podcast. They're all between 5 and 10 minutes. And you get Ni Cheng and I leading them. And so they're free. You don't have to pay for an app. So please take advantage of them. And we are also working on collecting those and turning them into something, but a project for another day.
Mm-hmm.
Our next wish list is that if any of you want to be a guest, you've either worked with us, come on a retreat, or you have a special skill or something that you think would be of value to our listeners that's in line with what we share here, reach out. We have reached out to some of you, and we like to have a balance of episodes that are just us and interesting guest episodes. And I think that it adds a breadth and variety to the podcast. So if you have something to contribute, now is the time to reach out to us so that we can get you scheduled in.
So in fact, after this episode is released, I'll set up a post in Mindful Healthcare Collective Facebook group, and you can comment there or send Jessie or me an email, and we'll make sure our emails are included in the show notes.
And send us your topic requests. I love getting these requests, and I get a fair number of them. Can you do an episode on this? Can you do an episode on this? We love your great ideas. And sometimes people will suggest a guest. You should have this person. I don't always know them, but if you know them and can connect us to them, please do. And if you have a total random idea of someone we might be able to have, we're always willing to ask. You never know what they'll say. But we've had some, I'm going to say, famous people on the podcast. Shauna Shapiro has been on the podcast, Kristen Neff. Help me out here. Anyway, we've had a few, and many famous doctors, listeners have been on the podcast and are coming to join us. So send us your guest ideas as well.
And please consider joining us for our Mindful Healers Connect in Nature retreat. We just announced for 2025, it's Labor Day weekend at Jessie's new retreat homestead, Nicasio Creek Farm. Or, of course, join Jessie rather on any other retreat offering as well.
And to end, in case you haven't listened to these episodes, I wanted to share the 6 most downloaded podcast episodes of 2024. And this is not in exact order. So episode 190, Wisdom Learned from a Malpractice Lawsuit. You Don't Know What You Don't Know, with Dr. Rachel Bickling. How to Make a Big Decision with Liam Mahoney.
Episode 193 is Their Urgency is Not Your Urgency. And episode 189, How to Embody an Abundance Mindset with our dear friend, Dr. Miriam Rue.
Episode 176, When Bad Things Happen.
And episode 226, Focus on What's in Your Control.
So if you haven't listened to those, maybe start with those, knowing that they were the most downloaded episodes of 2024. We want to thank you all so much for listening today and being a part of our podcasting journey over the last 4 years. Happy birthday to the Mindful Healers podcast, and happy birthday to us as the Mindful Healers podcasting hosts. And we thank you all again so much for listening. Please, please, please share the podcast, and we will see you next week.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes. And please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely.
Welcome to this mindful moment offering. An invitation for you to close your eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you. Noticing your environment as it interfaces with your body. Points of contact between you and whatever you're sitting on or standing on. And next, inviting you to focus on your breath at your nostrils. Inviting you to take a deep breath in, filling all the way up, even beyond what you would normally do for taking a deep breath in. Really filling every nook and cranny of your lungs. And then exhaling through your mouth, through pursed lips, as if you're blowing out birthday candles. So taking in everything that you need and enjoying all the abundance of breath through your nose, filling up every nook and cranny of your lungs, pushing your diaphragm way down to allow for the lungs to fully fill up with as much air as possible. And then when you're ready, exhaling, letting go of what no longer serves. And we'll do that one last time. In through the nose, filling up really deeply, every nook and cranny filled up with lots of nourishing air. And then exhaling, letting go of what no longer serves. And as you're ready, coming back to your nose, breathing at your normal pace. Noticing the in-breath, the out-breath, and the pause in between. Taking a moment to notice if there have been any shifts changes, or perhaps not. What's present for you now after taking those big, huge pursed lip breaths of abundance and letting go of what no longer serves. As you're ready, blinking open eyes, letting the light back in. Thanks so much for practicing with me.